Okay, so good afternoon and thanks. You know why I'm here. It's basically I've been requested to make a presentation on revisiting, as it were, Marx's Capital, 150 years after the publication of the first German edition of Capital Volume 1. And in these 150 years, much has happened, much has transpired. In fact, if we go back to a lot of the writings of Marx and Engels during that period between, let's say, the 1840s and the 1870s, the feeling one gets is that they would have been surprised to even be suggested, it would even be suggested that 150 years from that point of time, we would be turning to capital other than as something more than a historical document, a document of historical interest. But we do know now that we are not actually going back to or revisiting capital as a document of historical interest, but actually to try and turn to its method and substance to derive some of the crucial elements of the analysis of capitalism that was embedded in the 3 volumes of Capital and much other of Marx and Engels' writings, in order to be able to contemporize that analysis and look at capitalism as it is today in the age of finance. Now, it's true that in this 150 years, these texts, in particular the 3 volumes of Capital, have been revisited by people of very different persuasions and inclinations, periodically or repeatedly. And at each point of time, it was inevitable that the way in which you approached capital, the way in which you read capital, as it were, was going to be influenced by the circumstances of the time. And that must necessarily be the way it must be for a document which was not just an economic analysis, but a political testament. And it's in keeping with the understanding which Marx and Engels had, that the ideas of any given period or time is influenced by the concrete circumstances of that time. So how in some sense you approach capital, you read it to understand its method and substance, the way in which you contemporize it, but of course vary with the circumstances in which you are. So in essence, when we meet to mark this 150 years of the publication of the first volume, we obviously are going to be influenced by the fact that the circumstances of our time would demand the reading of capital in a particular way, given the fact that capitalism, and in particular capitalism in England, which Marx in his analysis saw as being the country which reflected in full force at that point of time the essential features of that mode of production, that much has changed. The capitalism which we see today is vastly different, and what I'll try and do is really first to go back to capital, to take out some elements and aspects of it, and then to come back to try and see in what ways we need to, or through what lens we need to look at those arguments in order to be able to use them to understand what the circumstances of our time are, or what they have, what implications they have for the circumstances of our time. Now, if we go back to, 3 volumes of Capital have a large number of subsections which analyze very different aspects of capitalism, starting from primitive accumulation, going through the analysis of commodities and the determinants of value, moving on to an understanding of the emergence of money and its characteristics, then trying to understand the features of, or the sources of surplus value, the features that once you have surplus value which emerges in a world of equivalent exchange, the way in which that affects both the simple reproduction of the system as well as expanded reproduction of the period of time, why that actually leads to crises in because of different tendencies, and finally, of course, an understanding of in what ways can capitalism itself try to counteract those tendencies and the implications that could have for the fact that this is a system which produces its own gravediggers. The fact that the working class emerges along with the emergence of capital at the other pole essentially meant that capitalism produces its own grave diggers, and therefore the implications this whole analysis has for the possibilities of those who constitute, in some sense, the exploited, the oppressed, in Marx's understanding of the system, would be able to seek to transcend it, to establish a system in which that form of private property doesn't dominate. Okay, so supposing we try and take out of this a few aspects which we think, which I think may be useful for us to focus on in order to be able to come to an analysis of contemporary capitalism. We need to, of course, start with what constitutes the principal advance of Marx's analysis in Capital relative to classical political economy at that point of time. As you know, Marx was influenced by German philosophy, the French socialists, and English political economy. And in fact, Capital, or Volume 1 of Capital, is called a critique of political economy. He tried to build his own understanding of the way in which we need to analyze and therefore understand capitalism in order to change it, that we need to do it, or he needed to do it as a process of a critique of classical political economy. And classical political economy was largely, though there were others like Kenny, the physiocrats, etc., was largely English classical political economy. And the reason why Marx focused on English classical political economy is that he felt that classical political economy, as opposed to the vulgar economists who came later, were those who began to write about capitalism, in particular people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, began to write about capitalism in a period of time in which the contradiction between capital and labor had to yet intensify. It was still in the early stages of capitalism, when capitalism was in the process of undermining feudalism and establishing itself as a system of reproduction, that because of the fact that this tension, or this conflict, this contradiction between capital and labor hadn't reached a certain level of intensity, you would end up with a situation where those who are writing about capitalism, particularly in defense of it relative to feudalism, would be progressive in character, despite the fact that they, of course, saw capitalism as being a system which was now going to continue to exist, while you needed to transcend feudalism and strengthen and consolidate capitalism. The way in which the English classical political economists approached it was that they thought that capitalism was, as it were, the state of nature. That was the way in which the system was going to be. But in this early phase in which you didn't have an intensification of the conflict between labor and capital, it was still possible for that political economy with its limited vision to be progressive in character. And therefore there is much, he argued, which can be taken from there, and on the basis of which we can move forward. We can build a system for the understanding of capitalism. In that, the principal advance, as I was beginning to say, in Marx was, of course, his identification of the source of surplus value. Marx's argument essentially was that we are, once we enter the world of commodity production, and commodities here are the elementary form in which all wealth appears under capitalism, the value of that wealth, of course, has to be measured in terms of the value of commodities, which is measured in terms of abstract labor time. That in that system of universalized production of commodities, you essentially had an exchange. You should have the functioning of a market in which equivalents should exchange. And the whole issue was that if you actually had an exchange of equivalents, how exactly could we source surplus value? How is it possible for the system to generate and appropriate surplus value in the hands of the capitalists, who then engaged in the process of accumulation? And Marx's contribution, or the principal advance, as I said, really lay in identifying the one commodity, which is labor, in which by the separation, in which the separation of the analysis of labor and labor power allowed you to understand that there existed one commodity which actually alienates its use value, which is its capacity to labor, but earns its exchange value. And what was its exchange value? Its exchange value essentially consisted in the value of those commodities needed to reproduce labor power. Because the use value of labor was the capacity to labor or labor power. That capacity had to be reproduced when a laborer entered into a contract with a capitalist. He or she was alienating the capacity to labor or the use value of labor power, but received in return the exchange value of labor power, and the exchange value of labor power really consisted in the value of those commodities needed to reproduce labor power. Now, if that be the case, what we are saying is that a capitalist who enters into a contract or buys the use value of labor power is actually going to say that I want to use this for a certain period of time, which is of course going to be determined socially, historically, and by the state of play of the class struggle. I want to use this for a certain period of time over the working day. Maybe 6 hours, maybe 8 hours, maybe 10 hours, maybe 12 hours. Now, that is the use value of that labor power. But if it so happens that the value of the commodities in labor time needed to reproduce that capacity to labor is obtained at, let us say, 4 hours is equal to 4 hours or 6 hours, then you essentially would have, supposing you had a 10-hour labor day and 6 hours of necessary labor, or the labor required to earn the amount required to buy the commodities which can reproduce labor power, you have an excess of 4 units of labor. So if you look at it, labor power is being exchanged at its value, where its value is determined by the commodities needed to reproduce labor power. But the fact that it alienates its use value results in a situation in which it works for 10 hours, let us say, it works for 12 hours, but receives in return an equivalent to its exchange value, which is 4 hours, 6 hours, whatever it may be. And this difference, Marx argued, was essentially the source of surplus value. So you can have, in a world in which in the market there's an exchange of equivalence, you can have a situation where there is a generation of surplus value, because there exists this one commodity which contributes to a product more than its own value, because of this difference between the value in use of labor power and the exchange value of the capacity to labor. Now this of course essentially means that you're also separating the understanding of the laborer and the capacity to labor or labor power, which is the use value you get out of contracting a laborer. Now once you have an understanding or let's say understanding of this source of surplus value, what you are in essence saying is that one of the defining features of capitalism, therefore, inasmuch as this is a specific form in which surplus value is generated in production and appropriated, that you are, as it were, in a world of commodity production, which is different not only because of the fact that the enhanced division of labor under capitalism results in the separation of very different kinds of concrete labor into different kinds of economic activities, but it also consists in the fact that commodities, the world of commodities is universalized in the sense that labor power itself becomes a commodity. Unless labor power becomes a commodity, then you actually would not be in a situation in which you can have this separation between the laborer and labor power, this distinction between the use value of labor power and the exchange value of labor power, allowing you to generate this surplus value, which of course, by virtue of the capitalist owning the means of production required to employ this labor power, belongs or is appropriated or is extracted and appropriated by the capitalist in production. Now, the thing is, of course, that the modes of appropriation, which is the second aspect we should turn to in this attempt, of mine to try and look to features of capital, which we need to keep in mind when analyzing capitalism in the age of finance, is that the second aspect we have to look at is the modes of appropriation of the surplus value. Now, appropriation is not merely of surplus value. The first appropriation which must occur is it must happen that petty producers and peasants must be separated from the possession, control or ownership of the means of production, because if they have possession, control or ownership of the means of production, then they would not be in a situation in which The only thing they have to sell is their capacity to labor or the labor power, and if they don't have, if that is the only thing, not the only thing they have, which is their capacity to labor or the labor power, then labor would not be transformed into a commodity. For labor to be a commodity, for commodity production to be universalized, there must be a separation of those who become laborers under capitalism from the possession, control or ownership of the means of production. So the first process which you need, which is what Max analyzed in his chapter on primitive accumulation, is the ways in which capitalism ensured the dispossession, ensured that there was a loss of possession, control or ownership of the means of production of a large mass of the peasantry and petty producers of different kinds, in order to be able to generate the workers whose labor power it can contract at the exchange value of labor power. That this doesn't occur on the basis, as many at that point of time were trying to argue, on the basis of a process of accumulation which occurred because of thrift, because of diligence, because of merit or whatever. But Marx actually said that this essentially occurred because of coercive, the use of coercive force in many forms. This, of course, coercive force in the form of the enclosures movement in England, coercive force in terms of the use of the appropriation of land and other assets in colonies which were as a result of conquest and plunder, the appropriation of workers as slaves or indentured laborers who were then taken to work the land which had thus been appropriated in order to generate the commodities which can serve as capital, and so on and so forth. So the first appropriation you must have is an appropriation of the means of production in order to be able to ensure that you have at one pole the doubly free worker, the doubly free laborer, free of the means of production because he or she has been dispossessed, and free to choose the occupation that that worker would want to take up. Doubly free in that sense, so that you can enter into a contract in the market with the capitalist who wants to employ these workers in order to employ that worker with raw materials or intermediates and capital in order to be able to produce in production, to generate in production the surplus value which can then lead on to accumulation. Now, besides this process of appropriation, which is an appropriation of capital through a process of coercion, of conquest, of plunder, of slavery and so on, of colonialism, there is another aspect of the appropriation which Marx spent some time analyzing, which is the appropriation of surplus value itself. And he basically said that there are two ways in which surplus value can be extracted and appropriated. One is in the form of absolute surplus value and the other in the form of relative surplus value. Now, absolute surplus value essentially occurs when the way in which you're getting additional surplus value is either through the extension of the working day or the increase in the intensity of work in order to be able to generate more goods in the same time of work by actually intensifying labor very significantly. Or, of course, if you want to move away from the world of the exchange of equivalence by depressing the wage below what is necessary to reproduce labor power. And doing all of this, in which there is no role for productive accumulation in the generation of surplus value and its appropriation, that this is a way in which you appropriate absolute surplus value. In particular, of course, the easiest form is the extension of the working day, so that there's much discussion in Capital on the battle for actually establishing an 8-hour working day, of the struggle of the working class at that point of time, of the role of the Factories Acts, and so on and so forth. The other mode of appropriation of surplus value is, of course, the appropriation by the generation of relative surplus value. And relative surplus value is one where if you have the value of a commodity consisting of a certain amount of necessary labor required to reproduce the labor power which is embodied in that commodity, and the total contribution in terms of labor time which comes as a result of the use value of labor power, then one way in which you can actually increase surplus value is not necessarily by increasing the working day, but by shrinking the quantum of necessary labor while still being in a world of exchange of equivalence. And how can that be done? that can be done by increasing productivity in the sectors producing the set of commodities which enter into the reproduction of labor power. If productivity increases in the sectors producing the commodities which enter into the reproduction of labor power, food, clothing, shelter, etc., then obviously the amount of labor time embodied in those commodities, that amount of commodities which enters into the wage basket is less than it would have been if you happen to be operating with a less productive framework, with a less productive set of activities. So an increase in productivity in the sectors producing the commodities which enter into the reproduction of labor power reduces the amount of labor time required to reproduce labor power, which means it reduces the amount of necessary labor time, and therefore, given a certain working day, the share of surplus labor will go up, because you have a certain working day, you shrink necessary labor time by increasing productivity in the sectors producing the commodities needed to reproduce labor power, and therefore shrinking the amount of labor required for that purpose. So you would have less necessary labor time, the same working day, therefore you would have more surplus labor and therefore more surplus value being appropriated. This role of productivity enhancement in enhancing the volume of surplus value, he identified that way of increasing surplus value as relative surplus value, and it reflected the more progressive characteristic of capitalism, in as much as this was not based on an intensification of exploitation, such as extending the working day or paying workers less than what is the equivalent of their labor power, etc., but actually by increasing the productivity of sectors in which the commodities which enter into the production of labor power are being produced. Now, there is in many places in Marx very clear evidence that he actually did believe that in one form or the other, both forms of primitive accumulation, which also take the form of using the state in order to be able to extract additional surplus value, by using the state to fix a longer working day, by using the state to control the mobilization of workers in order, so that there can be an increase in the value of labor power, the exchange value of labor power, through means such as that, and through means of coercive appropriation of capital in different forms. He did say that, listen, we can see that even with the coming of a phase in which the principal form of surplus value extraction is relative surplus value, we can see two things. We can see that processes of primitive accumulation still continue, and we can also see that there is, to a certain degree, means which are used to also extract absolute surplus value other than relative surplus value alone. Now there are places in which, because of the fact that he is looking to the emergence of capitalism, and he's looking at a country where capitalism was at its progressive best, having seen the Industrial Revolution, which is England, there is at some points of time, particularly within capital, an impression that one could get that really that what Marx is talking about is a sequential process. That there is a stage of primitive accumulation, at the end of which there's a separation of capital, there's a separation of labor from the means of production, capital confronts labor at the other pole, and then you enter a world which is a different kind of capitalism. In the former, you actually could end up with a situation where, when capital actually goes and takes over the means, tries to seize control over the means of production, it gets production into its hands in the form in which it appears. That is, in the form of, let's say, artisanal production who are put into manufactories, etc. So capital takes over production in the form in which it exists under the rule of petty producers who exist within feudal and semi-feudal formations, but then extracts surplus value through the means of extracting it in the form of absolute surplus value. And this he called the formal subsumption of capital, of labor to capital. So there is a process of formal subsumption of labor to capital, in which you take over production in technical forms in which it existed prior to the emergence and seizure of control by capital of the process of production. And therefore, you really are not in a world in which you're having much productivity enhancement taking place and in investment and accumulation taking place in that early phase, but still labor is subsumed to capital. This is formal subsumption of labor to capital, and in the formal subsumption of labor to capital, the form of surplus value that you extract is absolute surplus value. But then you move on to a situation where capital then transforms the productive process. It actually brings the manufactory, it increases the division of labor within the manufactory, it moves on to machinofacture, and finally it moves on to the factory system. And all of this is a process in which it is able to increase productivity by improving the means of production or through technical enhancements of the means of production, which allows for productivity increases and which therefore allows for the appropriation of relative surplus value. This phase, he says, is the phase of the real subsumption of labor to capital. So you have a formal subsumption with technical forms which existed when capital first attempts to seize control over the means of production, which it does over production, which it does by taking over control, maybe as merchant capital, maybe as usurer's capital, whatever it may be, of production as it exists. Then it transforms it. When it takes over production as it exists, it's dependent, because of merely formal subsumption of labor to capital, on the extraction of absolute surplus value. But then as it brings the production process under its control and transforms it, allowing for productivity increases as this transformation takes place, it ensures the real subsumption of labor to capital and therefore the extraction of relative surplus value. Okay? Now here too, there can be, on the basis of some of the reading of Marx, of capital, there can be an argument that, listen, you actually have, just as much as you have a sequential transition from primitive accumulation to whatever you call it, actual accumulation under capitalism, you also have a transition from formal to real subsumption, where real subsumption replaces formal subsumption. And when you do that, you have the extraction, the generation and extraction of surplus value in the form of relative surplus value, replacing the generation and extraction of surplus value in the form of absolute surplus value. However, in capital itself, and more so when we begin to read much else of Marx's writings as he goes on, in particular is his articles on, especially on countries like India, in the New York Daily Tribune, you actually can see that he begins to see how this process in which capital accumulates, capital itself, the expropriation of property, and capital actually accumulates on the basis of extraction of absolute surplus value, is something which goes well into the stages. And one can argue that if you look at the world today, where you actually have very little increasingly of formal employment and an increasing presence of part-time, self-employed, informal employment, in which there is self-exploitation and actual exploitation of workers, that this kind of extraction of absolute surplus value can continue even today, or does continue even today. So what we need to do is not really look at capital and say, okay, there was formal subsumption, there was absolute surplus value, and there was primitive accumulation, but that's all over. And we now are in a world, and we've been in this world, in which there's real subsumption, relative surplus value appropriation, and actual productive accumulation as opposed to primitive accumulation. It's not an either-or scenario, because if we have an either-or scenario, it becomes difficult, as I shall argue as a little later, it becomes difficult for us to understand how finance is able to appropriate surplus outside of, without being mediated by production. Even if surplus is generated in production, its appropriation is taken outside of production, and we need to see how. Now, once you have this whole process underway, then obviously what you have is the emergence of competition between these atomistic individual capitals, which are each, because now the objective of the system is no more the production of use values. Of course, it produces use values because a commodity cannot be a commodity unless it has a use value. But the objective of the system is the generation, accumulation and reinvestment of exchange values. It's the valorization of value, it's the self-expansion of value which becomes the objective of the system. And in that spontaneous logic, the capitalist really is just capital personified. His role is essentially that once you have a situation in which the aim of production is the generation and extraction of surplus value, and therefore its reinvestment to generate and extract more surplus value, his role essentially becomes one of being a cog in the wheel of accumulation, which is a spontaneous activity under capitalism. Now that spontaneous activity gets intensified because of the fact that there is this competition between capitals. There are these atomistic capitalists who are now competing with each other, and in the process of competing with each other, they constantly have to try and reduce costs of production in order to be able to survive in the competition. And therefore what you begin to see is that this competition takes the form of a constant effort to try and improve the means of production, improve methods of production, essentially in order to be able to increase productivity and remain, as it were, at the same spot where we are running, because otherwise you will fall behind and will be thrown out in the competitive process. So accumulate becomes the pressure of the system in which technical advance occurs. Now, a feature of that technical advance, of course, is the way in which costs of production are reduced is principally by displacing workers with machines in order to be able to increase the productivity of labor. Okay? So while this accumulation process is going on the one hand, the rapidity of the accumulation process is generating for you increased employment. On the other hand, the fact that this accumulation process is resulting in constant renovation and improvement of the methods of production is resulting in the displacement of workers. And these workers obviously go and settle in a reserve army which always exists under capitalism. The third thing, of course, which happens is that when this whole competitive pressure is occurring, if it so happens that at some points of time, and Marx discusses instances of that kind, because of the rapidity of the accumulation process, despite improvements in the means of production, supposing the demand for labor keeps increasing. If the demand for labor keeps increasing, then of course the size of the reserve army shrinks. If the size of the reserve army shrinks, it becomes possible, partly because of demand and supply in the labor market, but also because of the growing strength of the working class, which now has the benefit of employment and is less afraid of the threat of the sack, you actually can have an increase in wages. And if wages increase, then the pressure to improve methods of production and displace workers increases, because you want to employ less and less of costly workers in order to be able to ensure that the relative surplus value you are generating and appropriating remains the same or increases over a period of time. So you can see that there is this huge flush of accumulation and technical progress which is what gives capitalism its progressive face. That it actually, as Marx put it, it has this wondrous effect in terms of what happens to productivity and technical change. Now, the consequence of this is, of course, twofold. The first consequence is that at all points of time, you would expect that capitalism is sort of walking a tightrope between ensuring a rapid process of accumulation and the self-expansion of value, and a process of trying to ensure that this is not threatened by the fact that it doesn't have at hand a large enough reserve army of labor to keep wages depressed in order to ensure that its surplus value is not threatened by the rise in wages, because there is a direct antagonism between profits and wages under capitalism, just as much as that there is a conflict between capital and labor. Now, if you have a system of this kind, there are a number of inherent contradictions which emerge out of the system, which we need to take out as part of our analysis. The first, of course, is one which I've mentioned, is the conflict between profits and wages. If wages tend to go up, then obviously profits tend to be squeezed. Even David Ricardo had recognized this. And therefore, capitalism would have to find ways of trying to ensure that wages do not go up and threaten to squeeze profits. And the principal way in which it does it is to try and ensure that there is a large enough reserve army of labor which depresses wages and keeps the strength of the working class under control. The second, of course, is that there would be a contradiction between accumulation and consumption. Because if this rapid process of accumulation requires on the one hand keeping wages low and raising surplus value and profits, and it requires also constantly throwing workers out of the production process in order to be able to maintain or even expand the reserve army of labor, what you're basically saying is that the productive part of capitalism is growing, but those who are going to be the consumers within a closed capitalist system, which are the workers, are actually increasingly going to have lesser and lesser in relative terms because of the fact of this sort of pressure on capital as part of the accumulation process to, on the one hand, depress wages, and on the other hand, to enlarge the reserve army of labor, which essentially means you have a large number of workers who are unemployed and don't even earn a wage. Okay? So if you have this disproportionality between accumulation and consumption, you obviously are prone to a crisis of overproduction, or at the other pole, underconsumption, because on the one hand, you need to keep on expanding the reproductive and keep on increasing the reproductive power of capitalism. You need to keep on having expanded reproduction and accumulation at a faster and faster pace, but on the other hand, to do that, you need to actually generate a large and, if necessary, growing reserve army of labor, which results in a situation in which what is being produced it might be difficult to actually find a market to fully sell that produce, which means you can have surplus value embedded or embodied in commodities, but to realize that surplus value into value, which can then be used to buy more commodities and labor power to generate more surplus value and accumulate more, would get undermined. That is, the system would in some sense be disrupted. The system of accumulation would be subject to pretty violent disruptions at some points of time. The third contradiction which emerges is the contradiction between private ownership and stability. Because if you actually have private ownership, what you're essentially saying is that there are a large number of individual, independent, atomistic capitalists deciding at each point of time how much they should invest, what technology they must invest in, where they should invest, etc. And that depends upon their assessment, which is essentially a guesstimate of what would be the demand and the costs and prices of the commodities they seek to produce, such that they can not merely produce these commodities, have surplus value embodied in them, but take it to market and sell it, because there does exist demand, in order to be able to realize that surplus value and then go on with the process of the self-expansion of value. Now, if that be the case, you happen to be in a world where there are a number of independent capitalists doing this. You don't know what the other capitalist is thinking and planning to do. Each capitalist does not know what the other capitalist is going to do. All you can think of is you can have a guesstimate of what the other capitalists are going to do. But what those other capitalists actually do would affect supply and demand, and therefore would affect the demand for your commodities, and therefore it would turn out that you are either right in making your decisions or you are wrong in making your decisions. This would inevitably mean, of course, that there could be that if there is going to be equilibrium in which all capitalists are producing what they decided to produce, and there exists a market for them to sell all of this because people come to the market and demand it, that can only be an accident, because there's no reason why these guesstimates, which don't have a coordinating anchor, where investment is not coordinated, where capitalism is anarchic because of the fact that there is private ownership, results in a situation where there is a fundamental tendency for a disjunction between what is produced and what is demanded in the market. There would be some areas in which there are shortages, there are some areas in which there will be surpluses, and you could end up with a situation where you'd have a crisis, and once a crisis occurs, it would then obviously radiate from its point of origin, because when a crisis occurs, somebody will not be able to get the value he or she was expecting to get, that person's demand can no more be expressed in the market, etc., and the crisis moves from the point of origin and would get generalized. So this is the third important. So you have the conflict between profits and wages, which can result in crisis of overproduction and consumption. And of course, you have this problem of the anarchy of capitalism leading to instability and crisis of a different kind. Finally, there is of course the socialization of production and the strengthening of the grave diggers, because as this process goes on, there's a concentration and centralization of capital, where constantly there is a battle is one of the survival of the fittest, and as the fittest survive, they become bigger, and when they become bigger, they are in a better position to be able to swallow the smaller. So there's a process of concentration and centralization of capital, which essentially means that production is increasingly getting socialized. It doesn't consist of a very, very, very large number of independent atomistic producers undertaking accumulation and investment decisions. It has lesser and lesser of these people. But when they have lesser and lesser and concentrated production, you have the expansion of the size of collective labor, which is put together in these factories, and which in their collectivity can begin to sense, to understand, and then to actually begin to implement their role. That is the possibility of a working class which recognizes its role as a class and then works to transcend the system, increases. Capitalism actually generates in this sense its own grave diggers, and therefore there is a contradiction which occurs between the socialization of the means of production under capitalism through processes of concentration and centralization, and the ability of capitalism to keep the working class under control. Finally, all of this, Marx basically argued, leads to a grand contradiction. And what is that grand contradiction? That grand contradiction is that all of this really reflects the fact that the progress of the productive forces, the expansion of the productive forces, the advance, of the productive forces, very soon comes into conflict with the relations of production characteristic of capitalism. And that is, after all, the basis of historical materialism, of the idea of transitions from one system to another, where in each mode of production, there comes a point of time when the advance of the productive forces comes into conflict or is fettered by the relations of production. And when it's fettered by the relations of production, it provides the basis, if the subjective conditions exist, if you have an organized working class which is conscious of its role, it is possible to transcend the system, Marx and Engels argued. Now, these of course are the reasons why crisis, and of course there was one more, it's a little more complex, it's controversial, and I'm not going to go into it, which is the whole discussion on the falling weight of profit in Marx, but I want to keep that out. Thanks. I want to keep that out. But basically, what we have here is really saying that there are a whole host of tendencies which make the system prone to crisis. Okay? That is, there is no A theory of crisis in Marx and Marxist Capital. There are multiple tendencies which makes the system crisis prone. And within that system itself, which again I'm not going to, there are mechanisms which serve as counteracting tendencies, which counteract the tendencies which are taking the system towards crises. But besides those counteracting tendencies, if we ask ourselves the question, how come that despite the sense that you get when reading the works of Marx and Engels, and if you read reading Capital, that they sensed that they were in a revolutionary time, even if not in a revolutionary moment. That the 1847-48 revolutions might have been a lost opportunity because you didn't see the system being transcended. But they constantly said that there would be this more general crisis which occurs, a crisis which is going to result in the transcendence of the system. And basically, Marx said that this crisis would drive home to the bourgeoisie, the fact that this is a transient system. Now, if we are trying to understand how exactly that sense of being in a revolutionary time, if not in a revolutionary moment, not only did not get realized, but the fact that 150 years after the publication of that first volume, we are still in a world of capitalism, whatever be the form and nature of that capitalism. There are many things we have to look at, but it cannot just be the internal counteracting tendencies of capitalism. The first, of course, this was analyzed in in other writings of Marx, Engels, and then by many others who followed them, is that it is not, capitalism does not collapse on the basis of economic logic. It only creates the crises which actually brings home to the oppressed, the petty producers, the working class, the peasantry, whoever it may be, the fact that this is an illegitimate system which functions at their expense and therefore provides the basis for the emergence of a consciousness. But those subjective conditions must come because of the fact that there must be forces, there must be individuals, there must be organizations, there must be circumstances which in some sense transforms that limited knowledge and deep anger into a subjective condition which allows the transcendence of the system. Capitalism does not collapse just because as an economic system it's crisis prone. It has to be transcended, it just doesn't collapse. So the first, of course, is, which is not my concern here, is an analysis of why exactly we did not have in these 150 years an adequate emergence in the metropolitan core, but we did in large parts of the periphery, in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Korea, North Korea. We did have in many countries, in Eastern Europe, we did have the emergence of those conditions, of course subsequently leading to failure, which is not my concern just now here. But basically, in the core, in the metropolitan core, we did not see that kind of a transcendence. And later, Marx actually thought it's going to occur in England, and then he thought it's going to occur in Europe, in Germany, and then of course he thought of Russia and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that you need those kinds of conditions, those subjective conditions, and that's one reason. But the other reason is, of course, is that when we look at capital, the analysis of capital is an analysis which really looks at it as a pure closed system. There are references to colonialism, there are references to forms of use of the state, etc. But we do know now that two factors which are crucial and important in the ability of capitalism to be able to not merely deal with crisis, to restructure itself when crises occur, but to mitigate those tendencies which push the system towards crisis, was one, the possibility of entry into pre-capitalist formations and leading up to colonialism and imperialism in its many forms, including neocolonialism today. A possibility, which was highlighted by even quite early by analysts like Rosa Luxemburg and so on. And the second, of course, was the ability of capitalism to use the state as a mechanism to be able to restructure itself each time it was confronted with a serious crisis. Okay. Now, therefore, in some sense, what we are saying is that these two factors, along with the factor that circumstances militated against the coming of the kind of subjective conditions which are needed for transcendence in the metropolitan core countries for a very long period of time, somehow explains the fact that the sort of sense of being in revolutionary times which pervades the writing of Marx and Engels. In fact, Engels was angry with Marx because he was not bringing out volume 1 of Capital. He was not completing volume 1 of Capital because he says the working class is waiting for it. The whole idea that they needed the analysis, the weapon, in order to be able to address this. And he pushed because Marx wanted to bring out more than one volume together, and finally he had pushed into actually publishing volume 1, and that's why you have this long distance. The other two, of course, were not published while he was still alive. Now, let me just take 15 minutes now to just say that, okay, if I've taken all of these very selectively, because there are many things in Capital, there are many aspects of the analysis, if I've taken it out as a way of trying to use it to take on this ambitious project of looking at the relevance of capital, or the significance of capital for the age of finance within 60 minutes. I mean, in what way can we actually take these selective elements and apply it to an understanding of the age of finance? Now, what is the age of finance? I'm not going to go into detail. If you look at the period in which Marx was writing, it was a period in which, over the 19th century, you basically had a process in which the share of manufacturing in national income in the developed countries of today, and at that point of time, particularly in England, which was the sort of core country for his analysis, was increasing quite substantially. Whereas if you look at it today, what you actually have is you have a substantial share of services in national income. Within that, you have something like 19% of total GDP in the United States and the United Kingdom coming from just finance, real estate and insurance, which could be identified as areas of finance. And if you look at the share of financial profits in total corporate profits, from something like 7% or so at the beginning of the immediately after the Second World War, we are now talking about it accounting for something like 25% of total corporate profits comes from the financial sector. And of course, if you look at it in terms of conventional indicators like the ratio of financial assets to the size of an economy as measured by GDP, the ratio of financial wealth to real wealth, etc., these are huge and have been rising massively over a period of time. In particular, the ratio of financial wealth to real wealth. And this is in some sense the age of finance. Now, one way of looking at it is to say that this is a natural process of evolution. Can you do me a favor? There's some Chinese who are coming to meet me at 4 o'clock. Can you just, I thought I was going to start at 2:30. Can you just go to my room and just stick a note? You can go, if I don't finish by 4, then you can go. Just ask them to wait for 5 minutes. Okay, so if you have this coming of the age of finance, one way to look at it would be to say, oh, this is the natural evolution of capitalism. Look at what Kuznets told us. Kuznets told us that the path of development of capitalism is that first there will be a shift from agriculture to manufacturing, from manufacturing to services. There will be a shift from smaller enterprises to more productive and larger enterprises. There will be a shift from sort of traditional forms of organization to impersonal forms like the joint stock company. So capitalism evolves, and in some sense, maybe this rise to dominance of finance is part of this rise. I mean, of the evolution of capitalism over a period of time. The difficulty with that, of course, is that what we don't realize is that if we look at the big crisis which afflicted capitalism, which was the Great Depression of the 1930s, the process of restructuring after the Great Depression was one in which what capitalism did was that besides continuing, of course, with its policy of trying to extract surpluses, find markets, take out raw materials, etc., in countries which were colonized or could be converted into neo-colonies of one kind or another, was the fact that the Keynesian revolution actually conveyed the idea that the state must intervene in order to undertake expenditures, particularly expenditures of a kind which places purchasing power in the hands of the large mass in order to deal with the inherent tendency towards crisis and overproduction or underconsumption under capitalism. Okay? So you needed a state which undertakes these expenditures, and so you had the coming of a period of substantial state expenditure and an intervention which went on to be called the welfare state because of the fact that it provided some degree of support for workers while in work and out of work, such that that was an automatic stabilizer. Capitalism never got into a situation where workers were thrown out and there was overproduction relative to the demand which comes from the working class. A certain amount of demand was sought to be ensured, partly through state expenditure and partly through these structures of the welfare state. So really, if you're looking at the age of finance came after whatever you want to call it, after the golden age in which state intervention, after a major crisis, which capitalism came out of because of the Second World War, that then capitalism was restructured through state intervention to ensure a long period, the golden age, in which you had pretty good growth, you had low unemployment and low inflation. So this was actually almost a period in which you said that, listen, this talk about capitalism being crisis prone is old hat. Capitalism has found a way of addressing its crisis. It's now in a position to be able to ensure that it's a stable system. The difficulty with that, of course, is that This was fine up to a point, and I'm not going to go into the details of why that happened. But what we do know is that starting from the 1970s, both because of the fact that low unemployment led to an increase in wages, which was rapid relative to the rate of increase in productivity, and because long years of capitalist boom during the golden age had increased the demand for commodities, including of course oil, resulted in cost increases, which resulted in inflation under capitalism, and inflation resulted in a situation in which the ways in which capitalism had restructured itself in order to address the problems which had shown itself in the form of the violent depression of the Great Depression period, the violent disruption of the Great Depression period, that was no more sustainable. Those ways of addressing or mitigating tendencies towards crisis were no more sustainable. Inflation came, the state had to contract its expenditure in order to prevent inflation from getting out of hand, production began to fall, and you had the fact that increasingly capital began to start looking outside of the developed metropolitan countries as possible points of location for production in order to be able to reduce costs. Now, this resulted in a situation in which we had a process of a shift towards finance in the metropolitan core as being the means of overcoming the problem of the limited means of being able to generate surplus value in production within the metropolitan core. Okay? And therefore you had the rise of finance, and the rise of finance resulted, of course, in a process in which this finance not merely operated in these developed countries, it also moved into the rest of the world, the emerging markets, developing countries. And this has one major implication. If finance begins to go global, then it becomes easier to open up markets because trade liberalization becomes a possibility when you actually have financial liberalization and the flow of capital across borders. Why is that so? Because supposing you're a country like India and you decide to liberalize trade, what would liberalizing trade mean? You say that I'm going to reduce tariffs on imports and I'm going to allow imports to come into the country which I didn't allow earlier. If you ask them why are you doing this, they'll say, oh, that's okay, because that will come, it will change the production structure, foreign firms will come and establish production, we'll start exporting and we'll get export revenues. So you might be spending for imports, but we'll get revenues, foreign exchange from exports. The problem with that argument is, even if it is true that you become a successful exporter, there is a sequential problem. As soon as you open your doors, the rich of your countries will start buying from abroad. Even if you're going to become a successful exporter, that takes time. It takes time to establish capacities which are internationally competitive, to find markets, to build goodwill, to set up after-sales service, and so on and so forth. So there would be a period of time where, even granting the possibility, which is not true in most countries, that you can become a successful exporter by opening your borders, there would be a period of time when you're importing far more than you're exporting, and therefore you'll have a shortage of foreign exchange. If at that point of time you don't have capital flows to be able to finance that deficit, you'll have a crisis. So the ability to sustain globalization depends upon the rise of global finance. And once that global finance comes, you enter into a phase in which, in the metropolitan core, and subsequently, because this finance is moving out, in the peripheral countries, you actually begin to see something which Marx analyzed in terms of the role of money as a means of payment, represented by the bill of exchange. You actually have tradable debt instruments serving as money. I give you a bill of exchange which says that, listen, you sell me cotton and I'm going to pay you so much, and I say, okay, I will deliver the cotton on so and so day, the order is placed, I've sent it, you're waiting for the commodity to be delivered. Meanwhile, you have this bill of exchange. You go to a bank or you go to a money dealer and you basically say, here's the money I'm going to get. You hold this bill because that actually is money which is going to come tomorrow. Give me a loan to continue my production. The person who bought the cotton who's going to produce yarn is going to do the same thing vis-a-vis the cloth producer, and so on and so forth. So you have actually means of payment becoming new monies. And once means of payment becomes new monies, they become tradable. I can then say that, listen, okay, I'm holding this bill which that person gave me and I gave him a loan, but I need some money just now. Will you hold this bill and give me some money? Now that was the rudimentary forms in which market trading of instruments becomes huge and large, so that the means of getting profits seem to be much more. Now Marx did allow for the fact that interest-bearing capital can be independent, outside of production, but it can share of the profits of functional capital in production, because functional capital takes the use value of money capital to buy commodities, to buy labor power, and then actually produce surplus value, and gives a part of the surplus value to capital which has use value as money capital. That's what interest is all about. So he did allow for the possibility. Now you're saying that there is all this other capital which is outside there, which is actually making profits, and you need to understand they are outside the sphere of production. Now, one way, of course, is basically to say that it is possible to not merely, like interest-bearing capital, share profits which come out of production. It could be possible to directly appropriate, through the mechanisms of credit, surpluses from the system. I believe that that there are poor people in rural areas who need credit, so I give them credit. I find ways, whether they be banking correspondents, microfinance firms, whatever it may be, to ensure that there is a pretty high rate of repayment. I charge very high rates of interest. Those high rates of interest gives me money capital. There is no mediation. There is no money, commodities, more money, MCM dash. There is just MM dash. Now, what you are actually doing is that whatever wage is being paid, or whatever returns that self-employed peasant is getting, you're appropriating a part of it directly through the mechanism of actually making them subordinate to finance capital. Now this is all fine, and I'm sorry, there's much more to say, but I'm not going to go into it. But there is one big problem which comes out of this. Not merely do you have to find ways of analyzing how these forms of extracting absolute surplus value by actually going to poor peasants or marginal farmers or agricultural laborers and giving them credit and taking a part of their wages off as surplus for money capital. And if that happens at some point of time, you'd actually say that these people get so indebted that whatever assets they have, they'll have to sell. So you appropriate those assets. So there is a form of the primitive accumulation that can follow the indebtedness. But all of this is basically about the appropriation of surplus value. One feature of the age of finance is that this whole rapid growth of trade within the world of money dealers and financial firms results in financial wealth rising much faster than real wealth. That is, you begin to see a divergence between the volume of financial wealth and the volume of real wealth. Marx too saw it. But he had one way of resolving that difficulty. The way he saw of resolving it is saying that this is fictitious capital. This is fictitious capital, and there will come a crisis. And when that crisis comes, a lot of the value of this fictitious capital will be wiped out. Now, what about now? What about now? How are we actually going to deal with the huge divergence which is occurring between financial wealth and real wealth? The only way we can understand this is that if there is some mechanism by which these people who believe that financial wealth is being generated can be converted into real wealth. Because it's not that we have no crisis, but each time there is a crisis, like in 2007-8, of course financial asset values fall. But the state comes in, the state starts putting in huge amounts of money, prices of financial asset values will improve even when the real economy does not improve. So you might see some loss, but your loss doesn't wipe out all the financial wealth gains that you had earlier. So what are you going to do with this financial wealth? How do you actually sustain this capital, which is, in Marxist terminology, possibly fictitious capital? The only way we can understand this is to say that this is a world, therefore, where constantly the system has to bring to market assets which were earlier not tradable real assets, so that this financial wealth can be converted into real wealth. What are those assets? Well, one obvious asset is you privatize public assets. If you privatize public assets, assets which were in the state and not actually be available for sale and transaction in the market, now come into market for sale and transaction. But you also discover new assets. You make water into a real asset, you make forests into a real asset, maybe you make oceans into some form of real asset. You actually constantly sort of monetizing what were free goods or common property resources. You monetize them and bring them into the area of the real wealth of markets, such that you can convert financial wealth into real wealth. So what we actually have is a predatory form of capital, in which not merely do you have forms of extraction of absolute surplus value outside of production, but you also have this predatory appropriation of assets which belong to society as a whole, in order to be able to bridge the gap between the speculative financial capital and financial wealth and the real wealth that the system has. In some sense, therefore, we are saying that, listen, this is not fictitious capital in the sense, fully fictitious capital, in the sense that Marx found capital, money capital, in his time. It is not fictitious capital because the system of accumulation in which the state intervenes in order to be able to mitigate the crisis-prone tendency of capitalism generates a process in which it is always possible to transform certain forms of financial wealth into real wealth, and thereby actually ensure that this process of divergence can be sustained. That is the way possibly we can integrate those crucial elements of the analysis of capital into an understanding of the age of finance.